Forts Henry and Donelson. We're now going to talk about the beginning of the 1862 winter campaign by the Union armies. We're not going to talk about west of the Mississippi, but it was going on west of the Mississippi too, and east of the Mississippi. This is what the Western Theater looks like. If you look in the far west, the Confederates are in charge of Columbus, Kentucky at this time. Grant is in Cairo, Illinois. Albert Sidney Johnston has the main Confederate army at Bowling Green, Kentucky. There's a small Confederate force at Mill Springs, Kentucky. And then there's the Army of the Ohio in Louisville under Don Carlos Buell. You can see, if you see that squiggly line going from Columbus, basically to Henry and Donelson, to Bowling Green, to Mill Springs, to Cumberland Gap, that is basically the Confederate defensive line in the West. They have made the conscious decision that they are going to defend all of their territory throughout the entire Confederacy. The Confederate Western Theater is called District Number 2, or the Western District, is commanded by Albert Sidney Johnston. The Confederates have a unified chain of command. Johnston is in command. He has a second in command, General Pierre G.T. Beauregard, and then he has subordinate division commanders. But there is complete unity of command in that theater, unlike the Union Army, which we're going to look at. Earlier, in late 1861, the Confederates have violated Kentucky's neutrality. At the start of the war, Kentucky declared that they were neutral in the war, and they did not want any forces from either side in their state. That was observed until the fall, until Leonidas Polk, who was at that time commander in the West, violated Kentucky's neutrality, along with his assistant Gideon Pillow, who will play a major role in this upcoming battle, because they feared the Union would take it over. So that was an excuse for Grant, who was in Cairo at the time in southern Illinois, to move and take the strategically important city of Paducah, close to the mouth of the Tennessee River, and then a little farther down the Cumberland River. Look at that other slide. That defensive line is very attenuated. It's several hundred miles long. The Confederates have maybe 50,000 troops, 55,000 troops in the whole theater to guard that several hundred mile long line. Also, if you look at that slide, you can see the Mississippi River going through Cairo and Columbus down to Memphis. The Tennessee River from Paducah going to Fort Henry, and the Cumberland River going through Fort Donelson are like basically avenues of advance, avenues of invasion, daggers in basically the heart of the South. The Confederates they did have one advantage. You'll notice all the railroads on there. The Confederates were able to move troops quicker than the Federals were, because they had the railroads and they were able to use what are called interior lines. That's the definition of interior lines. Basically, if you have a circle, the outside of the circle, the inside of the circle, the inside of the circle, you're able to move troops around quicker from place to place than you can on the outside of the perimeter. That's the theory of interior lines. The Federals actually use the railroad to defeat interior lines later in the war, but in this case, the Confederates have interior lines because they have access to all the railroads. The Union Army, we've talked a lot before about what's going on in this state in 1861, and it's a mess. You have Nathaniel Lyon taken over temporarily in June. Then he's replaced by John Charles Fremont, and Fremont's tenure was chaotic, to say the least. So there's not nearly, the Federals were able to secure the state, but there's not nearly as much happened as the Lincoln administration would have liked. However, Fremont did some good things that kind of set the stage for later success. One of the most important things he did was start construction of the Union ironclads, the 7 city class ironclads, and also the USS Benton, which was the biggest and baddest ironclad of them all. Lincoln, of course, is disappointed by what's going on in the state. He appointed Fremont with high hopes. Fremont disappointed him. And so in the fall, in December, he appoints Henry Halleck as Commander-in-Chief of the Department of Missouri. Halleck, of course, gets a bad rap. Halleck, does some pretty bizarre things. He's not a warrior. But Halleck is a good organizer, and he brought stability to the Western Theater, which had not been there before. And I talked a little bit about before. One of Halleck's subordinate commanders is U.S. Grant down in Cairo, and we'll use the local pronunciation on Cairo. So we talked about a disunited command. That blue line represents the line between the Department of Missouri and the Department of the Ohio. It runs down, it separates Indiana and Illinois, and then follows the course of the Cumberland River, which is really strange. It's a strange boundary. Why you wouldn't have the Mississippi as the boundary, I don't know. But if you have these twin rivers, the Cumberland and the Tennessee, as an active area of operations, you basically have two separate commanders, two separate armies operating in that area, which leads to trouble. Violates the principle of war of unity of command. So Grant, from the time he gets down to Cairo, he is already planning. He's offensive minded. He wants to take the war to the Confederates. We talked about the Battle of Belmont last year, which Grant did in November 1861. And since then, he's kind of been idle. But he suggests constantly to Halleck to start a campaign up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. The ironclads are now in February of 1862. The ironclads are starting to come into service. Grant has the support of Flag Admiral Andrew Foote, who is the commander of naval forces on the inland waters, and also of Charles Smith, who is the highest ranking, most respected professional soldier in the West, even though Grant outranks him. Halleck doesn't trust Grant. Some of Grant's pre-war problems, the rumors of pre-war problems, kind of follow him. In addition, Grant is a warrior. He wants to attack. Halleck is not a warrior. Halleck is very, very cautious. He likes to build up massive amounts of supplies, massive amounts of troops, and then move very cautiously and very slowly. Grant is extremely offensive-minded, and Grant makes Halleck nervous. However, there's a lot of pressure on these generals to move because Lincoln is not happy. Additionally, Halleck is maneuvering for command of all the Western armies. He wants Buell's army put under his command to make a unified command in the West. So he is motivated to start an offensive up the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers. The gunboats that will participate in this battle, they're part of the Western Gunboat Flotilla. You have these city-class ironclads, 7 of them named for cities along the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. They were built in St. Louis and in Mound City, Illinois. In addition to that, there was one other. These were created from scratch by James Eads. In just a few months' time, he built 7 of these ironclad vessels. The biggest was the USS. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm skipping ahead of myself. There were also timberclads. Very early in the war, the government bought a bunch of steamboats, and they reinforced them with extra layers of wood, put gun ports on them, and they were called the timberclads. So unless you're up against some pretty good artillery, the timberclads did just fine. They were able to subdue ground troops and civilians easily. And there will be several of these that participate in the Donelson and Henry campaign. The big boy on the Mississippi and Tennessee and Cumberland was the USS Essex, and it is the largest gunboat that actually operated on the rivers. So the first objective is Fort Henry. You have Fort Henry on the Tennessee, which is closest to Paducah, and then you have Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. It was started before Kentucky neutrality was violated, so it was started in Tennessee by the state of Tennessee. It is built in a very bad spot. It's not built on a hill. They wanted it as close to the Kentucky line as possible, and it is, during dry weather, it was fine. During wet weather, it turned into a swamp. But it was just barely below the Kentucky state line, which is what they wanted. It had 17 guns, 11 covering the river. 17 covering the river. 11 guns were facing rear. There were entrenchments. Not only there was the fort, and then I'll show you a picture in a minute. Then there were entrenchments farther back to guard against the land attack. Because that fort, the Confederates knew that was a bad fort after a while. They started a new fort, Fort Hyman, on the west bank of the Tennessee River, to support Fort Henry. General Lloyd Tillman, who was a resident of Paducah, was commander of the fort. When the Federals attacked, there was about 3,000 soldiers there. Interestingly, no senior Confederate officer had ever visited Fort Henry before it was attacked. General Polk had never visited there, and General Johnston, who's going to be making decisions about defending these forts, the commander in the west, or General Beauregard, none of those senior officers had ever been to Fort Henry or Donelson to see what they looked like. So this is what Fort Henry looks like. There's a long stretch of river, so they have a long field of fire. You can see the fort itself, about 10 acres, and then the outer defenses to stop an attack from the landward side. It was also important for them to build forts on the east bank of the Tennessee and the west bank of the Cumberland, so they were both inside those two rivers, and they could be able to, in theory anyway, be able to support each other if one was attacked. So Grant finally gets the word from Halleck to proceed. So he proceeds up the Tennessee River, and he has with him 7 gunboats. This is, you can see for yourself the formation that they're using. This was no surprise attack. The Union had been scouting for a long time. In fact, the Union infantry landed below the fort a couple days before it was actually attacked. So the Confederates knew that the Union Army was on their way. Talked in theory about the two forts supporting each other. That didn't happen. Fort Henry was basically left to its own devices by the commanders, or by the army at Fort Donelson. The Tennessee River was in flood. I guess the Tennessee and Cumberland begin to flood every year, beginning in February, and the Tennessee had risen about 10 feet in the last week or two and was beginning to flood the land around it. They should have known that they were building in what was going to be flooded. The locals told them that area floods, and if you look if anybody you ever go down the Mississippi River bottoms, you'll drive and see trees, and there's like white marks on the trees, like maybe this high, where it's been flooded. The engineers could clearly see the flood marks on the trees, but they decided to build anyway. The attack, Union Army's plan was, Grant's plan was to land an army surplus at McClernand, to land one division there, one division under Charles Smith on the opposite side of the river. The gunboats would attack, and the infantry would attack from the land. The Confederates were able to hold out for a little over an hour, but as they were the fort was flooding the powder magazine and the interior of the fort as they were fighting. In fact, when the Union Navy received the surrender of Fort Henry, Admiral Flag Officer Foote sent the team that was supposed to take the surrender into the fort on a boat, and they rowed into the fort. They rowed into a boat, and the fort on a boat, because it was already had flooded the entire interior of the fort. And this picture kind of shows you what it looks like. A good part of the fort is actually underwater during the battle itself. So Fort Henry falls very quickly. It's a tremendous victory for the North. It's their biggest victory, even though the Army was never even got close to the fort before they surrendered. The ironclads got beaten up, though, pretty good. The Essex took several hits and had to go back for repairs. A bunch of men were killed. Some of the other ironclads were beaten up pretty good, and it was not even a very long fight. So the idea that the ironclads were invincible simply wasn't true. But it falls very quickly. There's euphoria in the North. Grant wants to go immediately to Fort Donelson and capture it. General Halleck, kind of surprised by success, is extremely cautious, almost panicky. He's also upset, which will come in later. He's also begins to get upset about this point. There's a rift between he and Grant because Grant begins to get all kinds of publicity, and Halleck begins to become jealous. All right, so what happens after Fort Henry? Not all of the garrison surrendered. General Tillman sent most of the garrison away, so they go over, and it's about 15 miles from Forts Henry to Donelson. So they retreat and join the Fort Donelson garrison. This causes a ripple effect in the Confederate Army. The Gibraltar of the West at Columbus, the reason that the Confederates violated Kentucky's neutrality to build that fort there is now rendered useless because it's been outflanked by the Union forces. So it has to be abandoned. Bowling Green, where the main army of the Western Confederacy is, has to be abandoned, and the Confederates have to retreat all the way down to southern Tennessee. So the entire Confederate defensive line in the West is now shattered because of this one battle. Johnson orders, Columbus and Bowling Green evacuated, but there's still no plan for what to do next. Basically, he's just going to retreat at this point. He doesn't reinforce Fort Donelson right away. He doesn't evacuate Fort Donelson right away. For at least for a few days anyway, he just lets those troops sit there, and his only plan is to retreat. Finally, after a few days, he begins to send troops there. More importantly, though, there's a general called Gideon Pillow, a veteran of the Mexican War, a native Tennessean. He begins to send troops on his own initiative to Fort Donelson, some from Nashville, which is upstream, south but upstream from Fort Donelson, and also from Clarksville, which is not too far upstream also, where, what's the fort outside Clarksville?
Campbell.
Fort Campbell is today. After Fort Henry falls, Grant sends two of the timberclads on a raid up the Tennessee River, south into southern Tennessee and northern Alabama, and they spread absolute terror throughout that region of the country. There is nothing to stop them. The Union stopped several times. They have boarding parties or land landing parties that go ashore. They destroy a couple railroads. They wreak havoc, and they really spread terror throughout that region, which comes back on General Johnston for not protecting that part of the country, which was his job. Fear grips the Union high command, believe it or not, even though they won. Grant, not in Grant's case, Grant knows exactly what he's doing. Halleck is just freaking out now. He sees Grant sees opportunities. Halleck always sees problems and dangers. So Halleck is shipping supplies, he's shipping men, he's going crazy, shipping people to Grant, thinking Grant's going to be annihilated any minute, not realizing the complete confusion in the Confederate Army. And Grant is just building up, and he's just getting ready to go. But in St. Louis, there's where Halleck is located, far from the front. There's a lot of confusion at Union headquarters. This shows kind of the dark blue line shows the route of the Timberclads raid into northern Alabama. They go all the way to a place called Muscle Shoals, which is now covered by a dam, and the gunboats couldn't go any farther because of the rocks in the water. Grant finally gets enough supplies. He doesn't really ask Halleck if he can go. He's assuming that he's going to go any minute. He finally has supplies that he wants. He doesn't care about troops. Grant is never one to complain about troops. He uses the troops he has. But he's got enough supplies. And the bigger thing is the roads, after a lot of rain, the roads dry out. So otherwise, if they had not dried out and if Grant had attempted to move to Fort Donelson right away, he's not taking artillery, which is not a smart thing to do. So he has to wait for the roads to dry some. In addition, the gunboats had to go back to K Road to be worked on because they had taken a pretty good beating at Fort Henry, some of them. So they had to go back there. Some of them were repaired, and a couple new ones came out. So the Navy is finally ready. So finally, Grant decides it's time to move. They move by 2 parallel roads over to Fort Donelson, and they invest the fort. They are able to march over. Grant knows who's in command. The cavalry patrols have been fighting back and forth. He knows that Gideon Pillow is in command at Fort Donelson. Grant had known and observed Pillow in the Mexican War. Grant said that he believed that he could march up to the fort and invest it without Pillow doing anything about it. And he was absolutely correct. The Federals marched 15 miles, basically surrounded or tried to surround the fort. The Federals at this point don't have any more soldiers than the Confederates do. They both have about 15,000 soldiers. And the Confederates on the inside have less area to defend. The Federals on the outside have more area, and they're not able to surround entirely. Even throughout the whole siege, they don't have enough people, enough men to be able to surround the whole fort. So back at Fort Donelson, it's constructed on the Tennessee River, or the Cumberland River. It has a long field of fire. Unlike Fort Henry, it is up on a hill and looks down on the river. It's not a huge hill, but it's enough that the ironclads have a lot of armor in the front. They don't have much on the top, so they are able to send plunging fire down on vessels that are approaching. The fort itself, where really not much fighting takes place, is about 15 acres. It's not nearly large enough for all the Confederate troops. It's maybe a few thousand troops live there during the winter in little cabins. So in order to accommodate all these 15,000 people, the Confederates have to build breastworks about a mile from Fort Donelson, which takes in the steamboat landing at the town of Dover, which is where all the supplies and men are coming in, all the way to Hickman Creek on the north side, the Confederate right, which is impassable, so they've anchored the right to a swollen creek, and they're left to the Tennessee River, or the Cumberland River. During the time that Grant is waiting for supplies and for the weather to dry, the Confederates are building all the time. They have been building throughout the whole fall and summer before, but they haven't really got a whole lot done. All of a sudden, boom, it becomes an emergency, so they really start improving the water batteries, and in just a few days, they throw up these very large earthworks, which those of you that have been there can see, they're still there today. So they get a lot done in a few days once they're finally motivated. You can see up here I've got the secession of command in the week or two before the battle. Lloyd Tillman is the commander. He's captured. Adolphus Hyman escapes from Fort Henry. He takes over. Bushrod Johnson arrives, who's the brigadier general. Gideon Pillow then arrives. He's the senior general. He takes over. Then he leaves to go send in more troops. Simon Bolivar Buckner arrives. He's the senior officer. Gideon Pillow comes back. He's in charge. And finally, John Floyd, this guy here, former Secretary of War in the Buchanan administration, he arrives, and he is the senior general. He has very little military experience. He had been in some of the battles in Western Virginia in 1861, but other than that, he has no military experience whatsoever. So this is basically what the area looks like. A little in the kind of upper middle, Fort Donelson, says Fort Donelson, that's the fort itself. That is about 15 acres in size. Will only hold a few thousand troops at the most. The black is the Confederate defenses. You can see the right over on flooded Hickman Creek, the left way over on the Cumberland River. The town of Dover and the steamboat landing are inside that perimeter. Inside Dover is the Dover Hotel, which still exists and is Confederate headquarters during the battle. The water batteries are water batteries, unlike Fort Henry here, the water batteries are outside of the fort proper. They're still covered by the fort, but they're actually outside it. You can see there's some gaps in that line. If you look and see where it says Indian Creek, there's a pretty good sized gap there. There's pretty good hills on each side. You can see the line on the left that's kind of been refused. Even though there's a break, it would be hard to drive troops through there. It's pretty well covered. There's also a gap where it says Aaron Hollow. That gap is still there. A really small gap. You couldn't drive troops through it. The most important road here to look at is the Wynn's Ferry Road. That is the road that the Confederates will want to retreat on. The Charlotte Road is flooded. A little bit beyond where the map stops, another creek flows into the Cumberland River, and it was flooded at the time of the battle and believed by most people to be impassable.
So where's the first road at again? I can't see well enough from back here. Where's the first road stuff down? The egress point?
Wynn's Ferry Road.
Oh, okay.
That's where the Confederates want to retreat.
But that's opposite Nashville, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's on the other side of Nashville.
But
yeah.
I mean, it's in the opposite direction because Nashville's down the lower right, right?
They need to get on the other side. Well, actually, they want to stay on this side of the river now because Johnston is retreating from Kentucky to Nashville.
Okay.
So they don't want to be on the other side of the river.
Right.
They want to be on this side of the river.
But I mean, Nashville itself is lower right compared to.
Yeah, Nashville would be lower right.
Okay.
So Grant's plan is to get his troops to envelop the whole fort, get his troops all the way around the fort, and then, just like they did at Fort Howard, bring up the ironclads, blast the fort into submission, and steam the gunboats past the fort, past Dover, the steamboat landing, and make the position untenable, and force the Confederates to retreat or capture them or whatever. But then if they reduce the guns at Fort Donelson and the water batteries, then they can go all the way to Cumberland City and Nashville, and there's nothing to stop them. Grant brings up field artillery. The roads are now dry. He's able to, the two sides engage in artillery duels to kind of fix the enemy in place so they can't be moving around a lot. Halleck tells Grant to entrench when he gets there. Grant doesn't believe he's going to be there that long. In addition, they don't have a lot of entrenching tools, and the weather turns nasty once they get to Fort Donelson. It's snowing, it's sleeting. It would have been really, really hard to dig entrenchments in the frozen ground. But not entrenching is going to become a bad habit for Grant. So the first day, the Federals kind of move to envelop Fort Donelson on the right. McClernand's division, his goal is to move all the way over here and cut off their escape route from the south and guard that portion of the Confederate line. But he doesn't have nearly enough troops. I mean, not nearly enough. Grant's got 2 divisions. He's got about 15,000 men. And you can see here, he's covering several miles of terrain. Broken, wooded, rough terrain. And he doesn't have enough folks to be able to cover that. McClernand again attempts to work his way around the right. He moves a little farther, but the farther he moves this way, the bigger the gap is in the middle there. If the Confederates could have counterattacked through that hollow, through the Indian Creek Valley, they could have rolled up one whole side of the Union Army and then rolled up the other side. But they didn't. They're in a very, very defensive posture. They don't have aggressive, competent commanders, so they don't see that opportunity. On the Union left, Smith's division makes some probing attacks against the Confederate lines. That line up there where it says Baldwin and Brown and Porter, that's a really steep hill. And their little probing attacks don't amount to anything other than getting themselves a bunch of casualties. Over on the Union right, where it says McClernand, you can see over Morrison, McClernand launches an attack, unauthorized attack in that area, which turns into not just a probing attack, but a general engagement where a couple of his brigades are involved, and he suffers quite a few casualties. One of the bad things about the battle happens there is the leaves catch fire. Confederate artillery, the refuse coming out of the barrel falls on the ground in front of the earthworks, catches fire, and burns a bunch of Union soldiers alive at that particular point. McClernand makes no effort to call a truce to get his men. Finally, the Confederates, on their own, some of them jump out and go save the Union wounded soldiers from being burned. For the Confederates, so the second night, which would be the night of February 13th, the Federals arrive on the 12th. The 13th, they do a little probing. That night, the Confederates meet and they decide that they need to break out, that they're trapped and they need to escape. So the plan is, in the morning, they're going to mass their forces on their left flank. You can see this. This right here, they mass all their forces on that side of the line, and they're supposed to have a massive assault at dawn. They move their forces from the right, from their right, over to their left in order to be able to do that. Dawn comes, most of the troops are there, but nothing happens. So nobody comes to take command of the formation. The soldiers sit there and sit there and sit there. About noon, General Pillow comes up. This is Gideon Pillow right here. He comes up and he gets ready to lead the assault. At that time, a Union sniper shoots an orderly standing next to General Pillow and kills him. And General Pillow says something to something like, "Oh my gosh, we've been discovered. Call off the attack." So everybody goes back. General Floyd is furious at this, but he's nowhere to be found. He's a commander-in-chief, a commander of this army, and he's nowhere near leading the attack. He's back at headquarters. So everybody goes back to where they were. On the Federal side, they begin to get reinforcements. Some of Grant's men that he left at Fort Henry, along with reinforcements from St. Louis, begin to arrive, and so Grant begins to build up his forces. We're kind of in the lower left where it says Lew Wallace. Grant creates a new division, and they begin to close that gap, which is really huge now. And that gap is at least a mile and a half, 2 miles wide. They finally begin to close that with reinforcements. Grant is still trying to shift troops to his right, but they've closed the gap a little bit, but they've still got a gap, and they're still vulnerable. There's the water. This is a picture of what the water batteries look like. The lower battery is the one on the left. It's not in the picture, but on the very, very far left of this is a 10-inch Columbiad, which is a serious piece of naval artillery. And the guns you see there are 32-pounder siege guns, the same kind of guns that they had at Fort Davidson for those that went on the Pilot Knob tour. So there's really only one really big, bad naval gun in that battery. In the upper battery, which you see on the right, on the outside, there are two 32-pounder siege guns, and in the middle is a 6.5-inch rifled gun, and it also is a bad piece of artillery that can reach out and touch from a long way away with a lot of striking power. So you can see the really long fields of fire. If you can, you would test your guns to shoot all that distance. It's a long way. So the Federals finally get the ironclads up, and they begin to attack Fort Donelson. This happens before the breakout attempt on the same day. The plan is, Foote has his boats deployed 4 abreast. You can see how it is over there. The St. Louis, the Louisville, the Pittsburgh, and the Carondelet in that order, left to right. The 2 wooden gunboats, Conestoga and Tyler, are following behind. And the wooden gunboats are capable of throwing their shells from a very long distance into the fort. But they don't want to get too close. They want to let the ironclads draw all the fire. Foote advances quickly like he did at Fort Henry. At Fort Henry, he closed the gap very quickly to blast the fort into submission. He does the same thing at Fort Donelson. The problem is, the Confederates only have 2 really powerful guns that can reach out and hurt the Union gunboats from long distance. However, Foote advances within 300 yards of the fort. At that close range, those 32-pounder siege guns are effective. If he had stood off, Foote has in effective guns, he has a big majority. He has 8. There's 2 forward guns in each gunboat, so that's 8 guns. Plus the ironclad or the timberclads could, with less accuracy, reach the fort. So he's got about 12 guns that can reach the fort and hurt them, where at long distance, Confederates only have 2. But by advancing close, all those 32-pounder siege guns, now they have 11 guns that can hurt the Union Army. So all four in a battle that lasts a couple hours, all 4 ironclads are seriously damaged. The Pittsburgh has to be tied up so it doesn't sink. 2 of the other boats have lost control, and they're just kind of floating down the river. It's a tremendous defeat and a great victory for the Confederates.
Where's on that map? Can you point out where the lower and the upper batteries are?
The lower batteries right here with the 8 32-pounders and the 1 Columbiad. And here's the upper battery with the 2 32-pounders and the 6.5-inch gun.
So did they take any hits from the gunboat?
They took very few hits.
Okay.
One thing I should talk about a little bit earlier. Before the Union Army actually arrived at Fort Donelson, the Federals sent one of the gunboats, I think it was a Carondelet, up the river, and just to kind of feel out the batteries. And they thought that they hit the Confederates, the lower battery, a number of times, and knocked out several pieces of artillery at that time. Actually, they didn't. They hit 1, which sheared a pin off one of the 32-pounders and killed the chief engineer there. but in reality, they hadn't really caused much damage. So it gave the Union Navy kind of a feeling that, well, if we knocked out 3 guns with one boat, we'll tear them up pretty quick. But it turns out they didn't. And during this engagement, they really didn't. They tore up a lot of dirt, but they didn't really inflict many casualties on the Confederates.
So if you lose steerage and you're drifting, in this case, you drift north, away.
Yeah.
Foote will then, after this, get called to go to island number 10, and he's north, and he's reluctant to attack, because there, if he loses steerage and he drifts south into the Confederate lines.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So Pope was like, why don't you redo what you did at Henry? He's like, it's a different ballgame here, Slick. Rivers are going a different way. So it's just interesting, even though it's Navy stuff and nobody really cares, but still.
If Lane was here, there'd be a fight going on.
Yeah, but he's not here.
Amen.
So hey, I got an amen from my brother.
That's it. Squid land.
So the Confederates defeat the Union Army, and once again that night they gather in the Dover Hotel, and they decide that they're going to escape again. However, it's really hard to understand. I think this must have mostly been verbal, because there's really no, what in the Army we call a common operating picture. A general understanding by everybody of what's going on was not created at that meeting. General Buckner on the right believes that we're going to cut our way out and we're going to go. General Pillow believes that we're going to cut our way out, we're going to go back and get our stuff, and then we're going to leave. Colonel Brown, kind of on the left side, he believes that there's no plan, no real plan, and they'll let us know what's going on in the morning. So everybody has a different idea of what's supposed to happen. What most people believe, though, for sure, is that the assembly time outside Dover is going to be at 4:30 in the morning. And if you look at this diagram, look all the way to the left, there's only one regiment, where before there had been a whole division. There's only one regiment now, 500 or 600 folks, that is guarding that entire section of the trenches. Buckner's division has moved over to the Confederate left, and everybody else is getting ready to break out. What most people kind of think is, as far as during the battle itself, that the units on the far left are going to cross the berm, and they're going to sweep around, and then the units that are in front, where Buckner is, are going to attack across that valley, and then they're going to meet up and they're going to push the Union Army out of the way, and that's going to open the escape route. So there are units that don't report on time, so the attack is delayed. Once it finally gets started, the Federals put up a stiff resistance, stiffer than expected, and they slow down the Confederate advance. Pillow has to come forward himself and lead a second attack, and finally the Confederate Army begins to push these Union troops on the right, begins to push them back, slowly push them back. But it's a stubborn resistance. The Federals put up a stubborn resistance most of the morning. Buckner, you see, he jumps across the trenches and he attacks, but he's driven back, so that part of the plan doesn't work. During this time, McClernand, his division is this division here, was here. He's basically fighting by himself. What happened, well, there was an acoustical shadow at this time. So the troops in the middle and on the left, Union left, did not hear the battle. Grant got up at dawn and was invited to go see Flag Officer Foote down at the makeshift landing to talk about what to do next. And he doesn't hear the battle until afternoon. So McClernand is fighting unsupported during this whole time, slowly being driven back. About 10 o'clock, after fighting for about 4 hours, the Union right under General McClernand finally gives way, and they basically retreat to the south into this great big open area called Bufford Hollow. Buckner's troops jump over the berm, join Pillow's troops, and the Confederates basically have, for the most part, opened an escape route. However, their attack soon culminates. Lew Wallace also gets a bad rap. Besides Halleck, he also gets a bad rap because of Shiloh. On his own initiative, comes to the support of General McClernand, and he takes up a blocking position right here along the Winds Ferry Road. He's got a couple brigades. He puts artillery in this place. If you've ever been there, it's not like flat ground. It slopes off fairly quickly. But he's able to put guns on each side of that road, and his troops down the sides of this hill, and they're able to have enough power that when the Confederates hit that, their attack culminates. They've lost momentum, and their attack has stalled. At this point, the Confederates, General Pillow orders all Confederates back in their trenches. So they all retreat back from where they started from. Grant finally finds out what's going on, and he rides to the battlefield. He sees some of Buckner's, he gets to the front, he sees some of Buckner's dead soldiers there wearing backpacks. And Grant realizes what's happening right away. He knows they're retreating. Otherwise, you don't go into battle wearing a backpack. So he immediately orders all available troops to attack back on the Winds Ferry Road, this area down in here. All the troops that have been hanging out down here, they get the ones they can organize. Wallace's troops, they organize what they can. It's just a makeshift attack, and they attack and help the Confederates get back into their trenches. Grant also believes correctly that for the Confederates to launch an attack of that scale, they would have to weaken part of their line. So he orders General Smith on the Union left to attack as well. So they attack up the steep hill, and it's a hard position to take. It's wooded, it's steep. They're taking a lot of fire, but there's just not enough Confederates. So they overrun those trenches, and they get a lodgment inside those Confederate defenses. They attack toward Fort Donelson, but Buckner arrives just in time to stop them from going all the way to the river and completely destroying the rear of the Confederate army. But as night falls, the Union has a lodgment inside the Confederate earthworks, a healthy lodgment. And the Confederates are back where they started. I got ahead of myself. That's what I just talked about. But yeah, you can see up here in the upper left, Smith's whole division is inside the Confederate works at this point. So it's going to be hard tomorrow to defend if you're outnumbered and you're just on open ground. It's going to be hard for the Confederates to defend. So the Confederates meet again for the third night in a row at the Dover Hotel. And there's defeatism in the air. None of them want to fight on. They believe that they're whipped, and they were in a bad spot. But they decide that they're defeated, and they don't want to try another breakout. They're just done. So they decide they're going to surrender. General Floyd, on the left there, decides that as former Secretary of War, and someone who did maybe some shady things in office toward the end of his time, it would be bad if he was captured. So he passes command to General Pillow. And then Floyd gets a couple steamboats and takes his troops from Virginia and leaves all the other troops there and escapes. Pillow decides that he is extremely valuable to the Confederacy and would be a great prize for the Union, so he can't surrender. So he gets a couple of troops and hops in a rowboat and rows across the river, and he passes command to Buckner. And Buckner is nothing if not at least an honorable man. And Buckner stays with the troops, and finally he decides he's going to surrender, or that he will do the surrender and not abandon his troops. Buckner really has a defeatist attitude throughout this whole. He doesn't want any part of any of this, and he's had a bad attitude throughout the whole affair, even though Buckner was a pretty good soldier for the most part. So Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest commands, was it the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, I believe? He's not happy about the order to escape. So after a few choice words, he asks Buckner, who's in charge, if he can be allowed to escape on his own. He wants to go across the Charlotte Road, which the Confederate High Command believes is flooded, and if they tried to escape, too many soldiers would die, so they don't even try. But Forrest thinks he can get out. So Buckner says, as long as you can get out before I surrender, and you're not part of the garrison anymore, you can try. So Forrest goes down there. He has his brother Jeffrey try and take the road across, and it's deep. Maybe if you're on a horse, maybe it's up to your waist or something. But he gets across, and so Forrest leads his regiment, cavalry regiment, and some other soldiers who aren't scared to try and escape, and they escape. And so the Nathan Bedford Forrest legend is born at Fort Donelson. The results of Fort Donelson. Nashville is immediately lost, obviously, because the gunboats can now run all the way to Nashville. Nashville is a manufacturing center, leather, iron. Middle Tennessee is a big hog producing region. There are lots of supplies stockpiled in Nashville. It is a complete disaster losing Nashville. It's the first Confederate state capital to fall during the war. 14,000 casualties at Fort Donelson, at least 12,000 captured. The numbers, it's hard to know the numbers for sure. Record keeping is bad, but a lot of folks captured. The Confederate defenses in the west, once again, are completely shattered. You have 2 navigable rivers open all the way into the heart of the South. Memphis is lost. It has to be abandoned because, once again, the Union going up the Tennessee River can outflank Memphis, so it must be abandoned without a fight. One of the major cities in the South. Memphis, Charleston, Louisville Railroad is lost. 2 other major railroads are lost. The Mobile in Ohio, which runs from Mobile, Alabama, all the way up to Cairo, and Memphis and Charleston, one of the only transcontinental or trans-Confederate railroads, which runs from Memphis to Chattanooga to Atlanta to Charleston. It is in danger as well. Those 2 railroads meet at Corinth, Mississippi, which will be the federal objective next month. U.S. Grant becomes a national hero. He usually smokes a pipe, but he's smoking a cigar at Fort Donelson. He gets thousands of boxes of cigars, which he eventually kills him 20 years later. Grant, when Buckner surrenders, he asks for terms. Grant, on the advice of Charles Smith, asked for unconditional surrender, and so Grant gets his nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant. This exacerbates the rift between Halleck and Grant. Halleck relieves Grant shortly thereafter on flimsy excuses until Lincoln finally said, Grant's won 2 battles and nobody else has done anything in the Union Army. Finally, Lincoln says, you either charge this guy or put him back in command. And Halleck backs down. And Grant is restored shortly before Shiloh. This sets the stage for the Battle of Shiloh. All this stuff sets up for Shiloh, which is going to be another another complete disaster for the Confederacy. And it's all because of this. It sets the stage for what's going to happen. And we'll talk about next month. But you can see in one fell swoop. And this is where we were before. And now you can see that red line. The Union Army now controls some Confederate railroads. They control a good part of West Tennessee. They control 2 navigable rivers deep into the heart of the South. And within a matter of a week, what's been a stable theater becomes a complete disaster for the Confederates. So, just some things to think about. You may have any other questions? Yes, sir.
Can you go back to the previous map?
This here?
To go back further to the map that's there. It shows the lodge.
Yeah.
Okay, at this point, Union Army isn't any bigger than it ever was.
They did get reinforcements.
Well, a little bit, but they're about equal in strength.
Not by this point. Grant has been getting reinforcements.
Oh, have they?
So he has 5,000 or 10,000 more now than the Confederates.
So now Buckner, he's the only military man in the Confederate man right now.
Yeah.
What are his choices? Can he
After
bring everybody into the fort and just do a siege?
that wouldn't really last very long. There's no room in Fort Donelson itself for all those people. That's why they had to build the outer defenses. You could only get a few thousand people in there. He really doesn't have much of a choice. I mean, the Confederates are done.
So the other two, the political guys, the ciphers, they leave.
They left. Yeah.
They get out and they leave to Buckner to surrender.
Now Grant and Buckner, of course, are friends. Buckner helped. They knew each other before the war. Buckner helped Grant financially when Grant resigned from the Army. Grant offered Buckner his purse, telling him, I know you're away from your family, and my purse is at your disposal. So they were friends. So they're talking and stuff, and Buckner tells Grant how Pillow wanted to escape because he was afraid that the Union Army would want to get a hold of him. But Grant says, no, if we'd have captured Pillow, we'd have given him right back to you because he does you guys a lot more harm than good.
Very doing well.
Yeah. Yeah, Grant was a good observer. He saw what Pillow was like in Mexico, and he knew the kind of character that Pillow had.
Not a question, but 2 comments. So one, Halleck relieves Grant because he says Grant's not forwarding him his returns, right? His strength and everything.
And that in addition, he went to Nashville, which he said was technically out of his area, even though he went there to confer with General Buell, who had finally arrived in Nashville.
As it turns out, he was sending his returns to Cairo, and the telegraph operator in Cairo was not forwarding them to St. Louis and may have been a Confederate sympathizer. So, okay. Secondly, so there's 12,000 prisoners. By the way, by far the largest federal victory of the war so far. They'd never captured an army, let alone 12,000. Ostensibly, 3,000 of them went to Camp Butler. Where'd the other 9,000 go? And you said there's fuzzy math, right? And fuzzy returns. Yeah. This is what I'm beginning to say from my presentation before is, okay, how do we know that probably not all 12,000 went to Camp Butler, but I bet you it was way more than 3. And so where was the accountability for these prisoners? And if we go see in a month, there's 700 buried there.
This is have a prison involved?
Yeah, but my point is, my working hypothesis is there's way more than 700 dead buried at Camp Butler. So, and this just kind of proves it. Like, okay, 12,000. Think about 12,000 people. Where did they go? Some of them might have gone to Alton, maybe. I don't know if Alton was open then. Some of them might have gone to Camp Douglas in Chicago, but
There were some, Gratiot Street Prison was open.
yeah, but I mean, how many could that hold?
I don't know.
You know, not
not nearly that many. And
a
that
couple
was,
hundred, maybe.
and I don't know what it was doing this time of the war. Later, it was for a lot of political type prisoners.
Yeah.
But Alton probably got some. Who knows, bro? You can probably find that out, but I don't know
Yeah.
the answer where all they went.
I know, and I don't either. And I don't think the point is, I don't think anyone knows where they really went. I don't think there was great accountability at all.
What I do know is this caused the creation of the Western Sanitary Commission because of the massive amounts of wounded Confederates and Federals. And the Union Medical Department, even though by later standards this is not a bloody battle, they had never conceived of this kind of thousands of casualties like took place in Fort Donelson. So that's when this took place, was when the Western Sanitary Commission kind of got going. There were, even before it got going, there were volunteers, nurses and doctors came down from St. Louis to treat the wounded at Fort Donelson. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if this is important or not, but Widow Chris home?
Yes.
See something?
No, that was just Grant's headquarters. Yeah, it was just a cabin. It's no longer there, but it was just Grant's headquarters. Other questions? All right, if not, next month we will see where all this leads to Shiloh. All roads lead to Shiloh.